My name is Kate, and I have lived in the city of N for nearly 30 years. When I was young, I often visited the village where my grandparents lived. I have always loved nature, so these trips brought me immense joy. Mostly, I tried to go closer to autumn, to gather berries and mushrooms in the forest. Back then, it was my hobby, and even now, I wouldn't refuse a walk in the woods. That time, when the eerie encounter in the forest happened, I was 20 years old. As soon as I arrived in the village, I set off into the forest the very next day to pick berries. Thicket, well, that's an exaggeration. I mostly stayed near the trails, but there were hardly any berries there. So, I ventured deeper into the woods, and soon the long-awaited fruits began appearing more and more frequently on the bushes. It hadn't been an hour before my bucket was almost full. I looked at my haul, and my heart sang with joy. It was time to return to the village. As I walked through the forest, I suddenly saw, to my utter astonishment, a small, thin girl sitting under one of the bushes. She looked no older than 8. The sight of a little child alone in the forest frightened me. I approached the girl and examined her carefully. She was dressed in an old dress, and over it, she wore a moth-eaten woolen sleeveless vest. Her legs were covered with dirt-streaked, light-colored, hole-ridden stockings and dark gray, shapeless boots. A scarf that resembled a dirty rag covered her head. Her entire appearance spoke of extreme poverty, and a wave of pity stirred in my heart. "Are you lost in the forest?" I asked, stopping just a step away from her. But the girl didn't react to my question at all. She looked at me, yet it felt as though she was looking right through me. My attempts to talk to the child continued for several minutes, but she seemed completely detached. However, at one point, her eyes took on a meaningful expression, and words slipped from her lips. "Yes, I'm lost." The little girl sprang to her feet with ease and clung tightly to my hand. I flinched in surprise, and for a moment, I even felt the urge to push the strange child away. But then I felt ashamed of this impulse and thought that the child must be terribly frightened, which explained her behavior. I decided that I had to take her home or hand her over to local authorities. I led the little girl beside me, and soon we emerged from the forest. "Do you live in this village?" I asked when we approached the houses on the outskirts of the settlement. The girl nodded affirmatively. "And who do you live with?" I continued. "With my mom and dad. They're probably angry because I've been gone for so long, and they'll punish me," she replied. I tried to reassure her that no one would punish her. On the contrary, everyone would be delighted that she had finally been found and returned home. The whole situation with the walk in the forest and the angry parents seemed extremely strange to me. I asked her who she went into the forest with. She replied that she went with her father, but then he ran away. This sounded even stranger, if not outright bizarre. I thought I should ask my grandparents about this family. We had already walked quite a distance along the main village road when the girl let go of my hand and stopped. "Are we here?" I asked, looking at the nearest old but fairly well-preserved and decent-looking wooden house. The child nodded in agreement. I knew this house. An elderly couple, a husband and wife, lived there. But I had never heard of them having small children. Perhaps relatives had come to visit and brought the girl with them. Without hesitation, the little girl ran to the gate, opened it, and disappeared into the yard. I had no choice but to continue on my way. But I should note that I felt completely at ease. After all, I had delivered the lost child to her destination, and thus fulfilled my human duty. When I got home and proudly showed off my berries, I told my grandparents about the strange girl I had met in the forest. They listened attentively but looked at me strangely. After my story, my grandmother remarked that the elderly couple, to whose house the girl had directed me, had no relatives. They once had a daughter, but she drowned in the river at the age of 7. Since then, those people had lived alone, and no one had ever visited them. Perhaps the girl simply made a mistake about the house. But the important thing was that she ended up in the village, and among people, she wouldn't get lost. The next morning, news reached us that the man from that house, which the girl had pointed out as hers, had died. His wife was left all alone, and our entire family went to offer condolences. As we stepped inside, we saw the hostess crying from grief. Naturally, I looked around for the little child, but apart from the hostess herself, there was no one else in the house. It occurred to me that it might be good to distract the grieving woman, so I asked about the little girl I had met in the forest the day before. Hearing my question, the hostess stopped crying, looked at me in surprise, and said that no child had crossed the threshold of this house in many years. Feeling awkward, I hid behind my grandparents and glanced around the room again. On the sideboard, I noticed an old photograph. I approached it, looked closely, and gasped. In the picture was a young married couple, and between them sat the very same girl I had met yesterday in the forest. At this point, propriety was forgotten, and I turned to the hostess again, asking insistently who was depicted in the photo. She replied that it was her husband, and their daughter, taken many years ago. Everyone present looked at me disapprovingly. And indeed, the woman was grieving deeply, and here I was, some young outsider, asking absolutely inappropriate questions. I had to fall silent and stop asking anything further. But when I returned home with my grandparents, I told them about the striking resemblance between the girl in the photograph and the little girl from the forest. My relatives listened to me and crossed themselves superstitiously. After a pause, my grandfather suddenly said, "It's the daughter who took the father to the grave. Only it's unclear whether his time had come, or she came for him early. You shouldn't have met her in the forest, granddaughter. Be extremely careful from now on." 2 days later, I returned to the city, and 6 months later, my grandparents also moved to the city, and I never went back to that village. The wife from the ill-fated house did not outlive her husband for long. She passed away 3 months after his funeral. They say that the day before her death, someone saw a small, unfamiliar girl in the yard of the house. Sometimes, especially on long autumn evenings, I think about that day in the forest. It feels as though someone invisible is watching me from the shadows of the trees. Once, I even heard a faint child's whisper outside my window, but when I looked out, there was no one there. Since then, I've tried to avoid forests, especially when I'm alone. But sometimes I dream of that girl. She stands under a bush, looks at me with her transparent eyes, and reaches out her hand. Then she disappears, dissolving into thin air. They say that children who leave too soon cannot find peace. Maybe she's still searching for her parents? Or perhaps she's a guide who takes those whose time has come to an end? I don't know the answer. But one thing I can say for sure, I will never pick berries in the forest alone again.